Good. How's it going? Hello, everyone out there.
Hello, hello. We are very happy to host you. We both work with Interaction Institute for Social Change, and let's take a minute to introduce ourselves. Amy, you want to go first?
Sure. My name is Amy Casso. I use she, her, and hers. I'm a senior associate at ISC. And I'm a Chicana based in San Antonio, Texas, who is by ways of Oregon. And I would say, thinking about my trajectory and how I got to this little space here is about my commitment to about 25 years of working for social change and racial justice in a variety of capacities. And I think all we are here to do is tell you about our experiences and how and what we've learned along the way to work in partnership with others.
Nice. And I'm Miriam Messinger, also with Interaction Institute, Director of Practice. And who am I? I am a white Jewish woman. I grew up in the Northeast. I am calling in today from Philadelphia, Lenny Lenape land, and I hail from New York City and live in Boston, Mass. I'm a mother and a bubby, and I think one thing I want to say is when I think about change, my go-tos are ice cream and movement, so I can sort of work the frustration through my body. How about you,
Yeah.
Amy?
Yeah. When thinking about change, I mean, I'm a real, like, we are all trying to live into that, change is constant, right? And the truth is that. But what I will say, when there's a lot of chaos and change, just like what we're going to talk about today, I like to actually lean into something that feels really nurturing. And that's actually my two pups. I like to give a little moment to them. Love, the love that's unconditional is always amazing. And to ground me, to say, is this really that important? Especially when you have a little pup who's just so excited for life and everything is just amazing. Every day he wakes up and says, today's a great day. And so
That's beautiful. Well, I think, and we might weave that in. I have to say, also, so welcome again to everyone. This is our first LinkedIn Live, and I'm
it
going to
is
enjoy the conversation with you. Hopefully, there'll be very active engagement in the chat. I know some of you who signed up are familiar faces, so welcome, welcome, and glad for new folks. And it is also super awkward just to see you, Amy, because we're used to being in rooms, be they virtual or
absolutely.
live, with other people. And I don't know all the folks out there. But what we're here to do today is to talk about the nature of change and how organizations and networks should be thinking about planning. We're going to offer you 5 practices and really hopefully dive into some of your questions. Amy talked about our personal experiences, and we'll also bring in our work experiences. And I guess the first question up is, when you hear the word planning in today's climate, what comes up for you? So I'm going to pause for a second to see if anybody has anything in the chat. Or while you're writing in the chat, I'll just say the main takeaway here is we're trying out some new ways to be much more nimble and to be very grounded and centered in our beliefs, in our principles, in our values, and to plan well, because we don't think you can do just one or the other. Hello from 100% Massachusetts. Love
Hey
to know what
there.
that means.
Yeah.
Welcome, Jasmine from Colorado, and our listener in St. Louis. Grace and flexibility.
Yes.
Grace and flexibility. Well, that's definitely one of the pieces we're leaning into. And while we're not completely poo-pooing the strategic plan, what we will say, well, I want to give a story of a very large, fabulous organization that really does a lot of racial equity work at its center. And they invested, we were working with them, but they hired somebody else to do a strategic plan. And we coached them on engagement of employees. And they were like, this is great advice. And then they followed none of it. And so they did a large, expensive plan and created a whole slide deck, and I believe never rolled it out, because subsequently, with new leadership, both staff and leadership were saying, well, what are we measuring towards? What what are we doing? And the moral of that story was it was a long and expensive process and didn't go anywhere. And while we think that that might be true with a lot of strategic plans in general, we also really want to ground in this moment of, I like to say, it's not just uncertainty. There's a lot that we're certain about. It's tough times, tough economic times, from people not eating to organizations not getting funded. There's a lot of certainty about how bad and the path that we are on, anti-democratic path. And there's a lot that's not yet known. But we know that if we only respond in fear and worry, that really tightens our system. We know what that does to us, in our bodies, and it constrains the way that we think.
Yeah.
So we want to just be in conversation with you. And I love being thoughtful and purposeful. And really just like hand it over to you, Amy, to sort of define, like, what do we mean by strategic direction setting?
Yeah, I mean, I do think just like a lot that you have said, and even your example, we have really historically have always believed and thought that careful planning is kind of a part of this bigger strategy that we do, right? As a part of the work for advancing many of our causes, and some of that we assume that there's some predictability in the future. And I think this moment has in some ways reminded us a little bit that there's just a lot of unpredictability in this future. And I think it's important to just recognize that particularly for organizations whose missions are really to improve people's lives, there's always been that tension between trying to know what the known is, right? And also still live into the unknown, because you're trying to meet people where they're at. And that in and itself makes it really, I think, challenging for organizations, and especially challenging right now in this moment as we think about, how do we all are by sheer nature sometimes want to control, right? Especially when you're running organizations and you are working with people and a variety of things. And I think that there's I think an understanding that we've lived into this idea of some consistency and predictability in it. But I think the last couple of years has really shown us, and in this last year has really shown us a lot. And I think for us, when we think about the like conventional strategic planning, it just assumes that you have that clear path from point A to point B. And, that leans into this, those clear objectives and fixed timelines and those detailed implementations. And what I think we've learned in the last, almost year is that that's really challenging. It can limit what we are living into and limit what we know about today, but also it might not leave a lot of room for what could emerge for tomorrow. And so, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that particular, thinking around like the traditional aspects of strategic planning, Miriam.
I mean, I have to say, I was never the biggest fan because of how linear it can be and because of how granular it gets. So on the one hand, great, but actually, were we ever living in that world where the 20-page action plans and steps could all be done in addition to what people were doing? So, but the piece I want to lift up and then ask you to like go into one of our first practices is, and we know, like with no planning, well, we're sure to get there, or we're sure to not be dismantling the attacks on our racial equity work. Like that we can't then say it's out of our hands. We have no planning. So that's all that I would add is like, look for those locuses of control and think about what does it mean? And I'm seeing people in the chat, like Rosie is saying, hold both individuals and systems, and still go forth and plan. So when we do go forth and do more strategic direction setting, what do you?
Yeah, well, and I think that's what we at ASC, we're trying to approach it a little bit differently, right? And we want to encourage teams to really lean into like the strategic direction setting that offers a more sense of a clear sense of purpose. while staying aware of that kind of uncertainty, but also the opportunity, right? Because at every turn, there's always an opportunity if we're open to it, right? And so, direction setting for us has really been about leaning into values, adaptability, and the co creation that can withstand some of these moments. And I often like to think of it as like a compass, right? Like a compass, not a map, because we know that sometimes maps get detoured. And so having the ability to have teams stay connected to their purpose, their values, even as like the winds change, right?
Hmm.
I think is really important. And so like focusing, I think, like you said, on the things that are in our control, in our locus of control, which is also the energy that we put to what we can influence. Like we know change is constant in organizations, but are there things that we can control for to a certain degree while and putting those energies to that? While also just, I think also the important piece around as we move differently and thinking about strategic direction setting is about to build that shared understanding and not about those perfect predictions, right? Because that's where I think sometimes, like you said, I've also experienced where folks have put out these amazing plans, and your funding gets cut. Now legislation or laws have come into practice and place that have basically upended like all of your intentions and your strategic directions around or strategic like plans. And so I think all of that is to say that I think we are really leaning into this idea that direction setting is about the knowing of your North Star.
Yeah, and before you talk more about the North Star, I was just thinking I read last week an article on perfectionism and the dangers of perfectionism. And as there's somebody I know who used to call it her irrational internal perfectionist, and there are times in my life that I had it. But as I read this article, it made me realize how inflexible an individual or an organization or a system is when you're aiming for perfection. It makes
Mm-hmm.
it for very brittle, as opposed to like a tree, which those of you who are on who know me know that's like my favorite bean, is moving so much in the wind every day versus a much more, we're aiming for a perfect arrow and it's
Mm.
brittle. But what do we mean? What do you mean when you talk about the North Star?
Yeah, I mean, I think when we think about for us and thinking about this work, right? Like you're always leaning into this idea of like, what's our purpose? Like, what's the beginning? Like, what's the anchor that provides us with a clear purpose and anchor in those values? And what we do know is that often those don't really change. You have a mission, you have a vision, and even as an organization, all of that, but then also for yourself, right? You have an anchor that grounds you, hopefully, right? and in thinking about how you move through the world, and that's how we wanted to lean in, and how we and thinking about direction setting is the importance of clarifying that North Star and how it's important. um, it's not only just a sense of belief, but it's also like this direction reminder, right? About reminding your staff, yourself, your partners, those you in your network about what you're striving for. And I mean, what we do know, and we think about history too, coming back, always wanting to learn from our past, and as we think about our future, is that uh, the North Star isn't just about strategy, right? It's about values, and it orients us towards, sometimes towards survival, like enslaved folks, freeing, you know, um, freeing, and moving towards, a direction for freedom, and others is towards justice. And more importantly, it's also about our own humanity and how we want to be. And so, having a North Star is a compelling vision. It helps us to keep, goes beyond just the day to day, to be able to get clear on like what our purpose is and maybe what it's not, right?
Yeah. And when we were writing that blog post, it was sort of a duh moment, but it
Yeah.
reminded me like, oh, when we talk about the North Star, this is like a little bit of a co-opting of like this deep freedom seeking purpose. It's not like, oh, what's your North Star? What's your big, hairy, audacious goal? It's not like a cute thing. It's really about what are you about? What's anchoring you? And where are you heading?
Yeah.
What are you striving for? What are you yearning for? So I just want to sort of like, I know a lot of folks on the call are also internal or external facilitators and consultants, and really like, let's remember this is about who are we accountable to, and not just like, oh, my North Star is, like not something that's cutesy, but really, I have nothing against cutesy, but but that has some oomph to it. That's really sacred, because that's what we're talking about. I think sacredness when we're talking about the North Star. And I'm curious, what folks online, like what's something that you would consider of that depth and heft of like, what's your North Star? What do you name that for your organization? Let's see let's just get inspired by a few, and then we can go on to another practice. If I could sing, I'd be like,
I know. And I think what you said is just really important, right? Is that there's just something more than just the individual, but in his purpose. We keep on talking a lot about, like, especially in these moments, how do you stay grounded while still being able to see the horizon? And the North Star allows for some of that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We
have some. Yeah, he's suffering.
I can't see the last word, but I see that it's something about restoring
wholeness.
Okay. Oh, that's beautiful. Thank you, Jenny. That's definitely has some heft to it. Well, let me, are you okay if I switch to another practice?
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about, once teams have that clarity, like, what is grounding them? Like, how about we might think about next?
Yeah. So again, back to my favorite metaphor of a tree. So if your roots are really solid, and I really think of North Star can be like the roots, like where you planted, and the branches of like, where are you heading? And to take that, like important, hefty place that we want to be going to, and the things that are in many ways like our bottom lines, the things that we won't give up. And then to say, how do we plan? And so one of the next practices is the need to plan for multiple futures. So I would say a few things around that. One is at ISC, we started asking these questions probably pretty early this year, like seeing, it's not even like writing on the wall. We're all dealing with budget impacts. We're all dealing with people being in fear. We're dealing with limited attention spans. And so asking like, well, what's the context in which we're planning? And so while it's really, really hard and deeply difficult to name, like, but I will name it right now. We're dealing with, I hear your pups. They are opining on the future. But that there are attacks on racial equity. We're seeing, I'm not one to say like this is worse than other times, because man, we've all lived and other people have lived through really tough times. But these are legal attacks on things that we just thought we were at least taking for granted on some level, that we're building from here. We're far from perfection or far from where we want to be, but that there's some things that are not going away. Well, we were wrong about that. So the attacks are becoming even more targeted and dangerous, and that's spilling out into the public sphere of like how we interact with one another as well. And we're seeing, for those of us who are nonprofits, be it consulting or offering services or advocacy organizations, is that funders don't have less money, but they're figuring out the ways that they want to be strategic, and the work is harder. And then those who rely on federal funds, of course. It's tragic. I was working with a bunch of environmental groups yesterday in Philadelphia, and originally they were gathering around how to expand federal funding. That was like 2 years ago. And so the whole nature of the learning community has changed, but how do they be strategic and creative in these times? So, it's hard to name it, but what's an org to do? You can't stick your head in the sand, or if you do, you become irrelevant and an easier target. So I'd say in terms of like tools, before you say, what are all of these possible futures? I recommend some grounding. Like, we need to breathe together because these are difficult times. Let's acknowledge it. So taking the deep breath, everybody online, you're eating lunch, you're getting ready for lunch, also take those deep breaths. And also like consider the strengths around your table, around your team. Some of us like love to surf uncertainty. I'm like neither at one end of the spectrum or the other, but sort of solidly in the middle. I have colleagues who like deal so much better and so much more visionary than I in times of deep change. And so I lean on their strengths. So maybe think for yourself,
Mm-hmm.
where are you on that spectrum from like, I'm in panic mode to, oh, the more change, the better, the more interesting. It really kicks in my nervous system. I don't know, where would you put yourself, Amy?
I think I can lean into, I find myself being really great at sometimes at being in times of crisis to be much more of a calming voice and being like, okay, this is what we need to do. But I also love, I think it's important for us to kind of lean into to having those multiple plans of and really reflecting on what the possibilities can be, because I think it also brings in a sense of like, while we're leaning into uncertainty, there's still some things that we can know that can really help.
Yeah. And whether we know it or not, I know you and I are both that, and ISC is all about that, is also still naming like, what's our vision and where's the joy? Because, the challenges are known, but let's also know the joy. But once you've like done some strengths consideration and are a little bit grounded, so you can sort of say, hey, we have to look at some difficult realities together. One thing we did was, good point. I'm seeing the Jasmine saying it really depends on the kind of change, right? Because sometimes like in family mode, it's like I can kick into action. And then when we're dealing with the demise of democracy, sometimes I get overwhelmed like the rest of us, right? And I'm less creative. But one thing that we did was come up with a strategy filter, which, you take your North Star and then you put it into like, what are some of the values and principles that must be in your strategic direction, right? And if you have difficult budget decisions, you would come back to that filter. So spending some time together with your team, or if you're consulting for an organization, with them to sort of say, you can't have too many because then you'll never use the tool, but what are 3, 4, or 5 things that are like absolutely non-starters, I don't know if I'm using that the right way, but I think you know what I mean, that like, without this, we're not who we are. So we had some about our values. We had some about, are we contributing to positive political change in our lexicon? Or is it ideally helping us financially so that we can, make sure our staff get paid and have good health insurance? Is it putting us in connection and partnership with the people who are most impacted and also most making change? So we would recommend some kind of strategy filter, and then to use it, because we go back, and a lot of the things that we do are teaching on some levels simple and thoughtful tools about collaboration, in our facilitative leadership workshops, for example. But how do you get to a strategy filter? You have to build a lot of small agreements along the way. So how are you doing it? How are you making sure it's not just the loudest voice in the room? And beyond the strategy filter, just knowing that, things that will come up can be external, like new executive orders, new conditions in the street, Some of them can be internal, like, oh, we had this grand plan and staff is exhausted and burnt out. Like, how are we going to attend to that? And we'll talk about that in the last practice. Or we came up with this and the board is like, no, we don't think that's financially sustainable. How do you deal with those different futures? And I think we're arguing if you have a North Star and if you have some clear bottom lines and your strategy filter, rather than having 3 plans, 3 goals that you're going to execute on, that you're in a better position. Amy, anything you see in the chat or anything else that you would want to add there?
Yeah, I mean, nothing else in the chat. I think the other thing about thinking about how we plan for multiple futures, I think our example that we did a little work at ISC really is using those that filter to help also think about what other multiple futures could happen as well, to be able to like foresee what could be possible a little bit, even in the conditions of the unknown. And I think that's actually really helpful because we stayed grounded to our purpose and our North Star, but also we're able to explore. I think at this moment when folks are in times of contraction, it's easy to hinder your own radical imagination.
That's beautiful. Yeah.
And so like we want to live into abundance, but sometimes it feels so difficult when you know you're in a budget crunch, you know, staff is burnt out, you know, the needs from the communities that you're serving are tremendous, and being able to live into that level of abundance and radical imagination can feel very daunting, but sometimes having some tools to really help that, I think is really helpful, right? Like, even if it's not even beautiful in the sense like we aspire to have all of these things, but sometimes it's like, let's just get real. If half of our budget gets cut, what do we do? And how do we still, well, how do we still live into our values? How do we?
And I think you told me about an organization that had done like a robust strategic plan and then hadn't planned for multiple futures, hadn't planned for, and what did they do with that plan?
Unfortunately, that plan got shelved. So they spent a whole year doing a strategic planning process, and here comes this year. And all of their grantees, all of their folks that they were working with, like got thrown up the air because meeting the emergence of what is needed was not may have been in the plan, but was not the priority in the plan. And so they had to they said, basically they spent all this money and just let it kind of to the wayside, you know, and I think we can do better.
Yeah, so now we have like 2 stories of that. So why don't we, like, as we think about that, and I want to be balance the like having reality colored glasses on, not being too Pollyannish. So obviously we have to be in vision. I think it was Ayanna Pressley who talked this week on the House floor about like what's your vision. And what are you doing for the hungry people was what she was talking to. But I think what I've seen in many places is that the tendency is like times get tough right now. And sometimes rather than doing what we know we should do, we shrink in. So I'm curious, like, let's talk about the next practice of design for flexibility and collaboration. How do you think that is critical these days?
Yeah, you know, and I think when we think about like designing also for multiple scenarios, we're already leaning into flexibility, right? You're leaning into flexibility around that, and in some ways, you can simply be like, also like you leaning into like this sense of there's something. We're going to be flexible, and maybe there's a little of abundance in there, right? In that flexibility, because you want to bring in more people through collaboration. And today's reality, honestly, it demands us to create co-create spaces of emergence for experimentation, and to make sure, because we know that these conditions are constantly changing, and the more folks that we can bring into the fold, not only does it build in that level of buy-in, but it also opens up the possibilities for allowing us to use that level of radical imagination from all of us, that energy that's really important, I think, in these moments. And so being able to adapt in those real times comes from all of this set of folks coming together. And when we think about like design, the designing for flexibility, and we also in particularly really think about strategic direction setting, for us it really means it's somewhat of a strategy around a living document, right? So flexibility, collaboration, in some ways to meet this moment and adapt is about having a living document, that you can say, hey, tomorrow something comes down as an executive order that really shaped how you do your work. Let's figure out how we can be nimble enough to address that, right? And so when we think about historically, when we think about organizational effectiveness and sustainability, one thing in a lot of like organizational development research has said is like it's what has always been I'd say for folks who live into resiliency as organizations or sustainability is their ability to adapt and to learn.
Mm.
And so for folks who are able to do that through having flexibility, nimbleness, and having something, means they're able to actually be much more effective at learning on the fly. That becomes really critical. I don't know
Yeah.
if you've ever, like, when you think about your experience in around flexibility and the ability to move and shift and learn, how that feels really important or maybe not important.
Yeah, I'm actually just like trying to feel it right now in my body. And it's just like, oh, what? There was like an openness. And so some for me, I mean, it ties deeply to the other piece that you've been talking about, a collaboration. So I think that my story might be a little bit more that, but I used to be an executive director of a, small, medium size youth leadership, youth empowerment organization. And, I was fairly, like, I was 35 when I became the ED. Now, of course, I was like a good 10 to 15 years older than everybody else. So they thought I was a grandma way before I was a grandma, which just happens to be my
Yeah.
favorite role in the world. But I would go into these like near panics of like, oh my God, this is so difficult, or we're having this conflict. What do I need to do? What's the answer? And falling into that, both the perfectionist mindset, but also in the erroneous, I would say erroneous definition of leadership as a singular,
Yeah.
smart, maybe brilliant person who's going to fix the things. And whenever I would fall into that trap, something or someone would remind me that we were a we. And particularly in a youth adult empowerment organization, there should have been no way that in a multiracial organization that I, as a white woman, was coming up with the solutions. That was, crazy town thinking. But that's really what I think about is the tendency that I think it's worked its way through me and over decades, but that many of us still have of like, oh, I need to come up with the answer, or our organization must know the thing, as opposed to, I think on an individual level, for those of you who might be program leads or executive directors or presidents, like, don't do this stuff alone. It's not going to be as smart or as nimble or as effective. Don't do it alone. There are a lot of like tools for collaboration, but also as organizations, also don't do it alone. Like, we're in deep partnership with a lot of other capacity building organizations because we know we're smarter together. And so there are tools for that. There's tools around engaging people. And when we were
Yep.
advising that, I won't name the names, but like a big fancy consulting firm around engagement, we know that if you bring people in early, then you come up with plans or strategy filters that are much more attuned and that have much more ownership of your people, and are therefore going to happen, as opposed to like fancy strategic plans that very few people are involved in, and then nobody knows what it says and nobody's tracking towards them because or you have to sell it to
Yeah.
them.
Like,
So, yeah.
collaboration and co-creation makes you stronger, right? It just makes you stronger. And so like knowing that we don't have to be this in ourselves as an individual leader or as an organization, that being in community and in collaboration and co-creation with each other just makes the work much more impactful, but also more important, right? And how you do that work is always the important piece, right? Like, so when we think about the practice of flexibility, collaboration, and we think about like, how do you do that? You lean into those key things of engagement, right? To get buy-in, to build trust. You find multiple ways also to really find ways to engage in this shared leadership. So you have shared responsibility. You want to make sure we're designing for those whole people, because organizations are made up of humans, and so we have to be thinking about the human aspect of all of this, right? Not only from the context of your team and your staff, but also from your partners and who you want to engage in this process with, and
Yeah.
and then also just to be really values aligned, right, in how we do this work and how you do it, and at every step making sure that we're being thoughtful about how we living into those values, and when we think about how we want to envision how we want to do this work for the future. And
Yeah.
so
And I think that really kind of leads us into our fourth practice, which is around centering equity and building power. And we've
mhm,
really already begun talking to it. But there, I would say, I was talking to a lawyer yesterday who was saying, and we say this too to our clients, particularly around issues of racial equity. If you have the power and privilege, and sometimes the smallness not to be recognized, like stand up and use the language that you know is important. Sometimes we need to change language. We have done that for a few contracts where we know it's going to go through federal kind
mhm.
of legal review. But if not, we're a small organization. Probably nobody's coming after us. And any if they are, we want them to come after us for something that we do well. I probably shouldn't say that out loud. Can we strike that from the record? But to really think about in strategic direction setting, again, make sure you're centering equity, whatever language you use. We know from hundreds of years that when we don't,
Mhm.
we get, social service programs who are the deserving poor and who are not the deserving poor in ways that we see the language today around SNAP and everything. So what are some of the things that you would say
Yeah.
we do around that?
Well, I mean, I think one that being sometimes I say the belly of the beast in Texas, you know, when times are tough, right? And it sometimes can be easy to fall into a place where you don't lean into centering equity or even thinking about building power and how you utilize your power. And those are the times where you actually need to do it more importantly. If it's not about how you stand in your power or the languages that you use, but I think sometimes it's about being really thoughtful about how we need to be much more centered around equity and not lose sight and be short-sighted in those efforts, because those are the key pieces that reflect your values, and so how important it is. And so sometimes that is about intentionally creating spaces to make sure that those who are most impacted by the decisions that you're about to make, as you think about where and how you want to live into your work, you need to make sure you're thinking about who's at that table, right? I think we said it earlier, right?
Yeah.
And how, what power that folks have to ensure that you're sharing those levels of power, and how important it is. I think about like processes are about how we can center equity in a way that builds power, not with but with not over. And so like
Yeah.
it's really important as we think about centering and building power, how to do that. We got to do that at every turn when we think about our plans, as opportunities, really as opportunities to build power in our communities. And so just thinking about our strategic direction setting, right? It's about how we engaging our communities in this process. It's about how organizations can utilize their influence to make space, to share power, right? And to strengthen relationships, especially with those who are most impacted by what's happening, but also those often at the margins and whose voices are often overlooked.
Yeah. Um, yeah, and feel free, those of
Oh,
you who are on, to put in, like, whose
mm,
perspective do you need? Which tables are you convening? Who's there? Who's not there? Um, and at Interaction Institute, we for sure talk about power, but not as something to be feared, something that's to own, because we each have. I mean, I always think the beauty of systems work is remembering that systems are made up of people and that we can make those changes, and that we have to have the multiple viewpoints.
yeah. I think the really important piece, thinking coming back to power, that I think at ISC has always really leaned in, is to especially think about how race and identity shape it, right?
Yeah.
In all of this work. And, and so I think that's always an important piece of all of this, is to make sure, who's at that table, who holds that power, and
Yeah.
not shy away from it, because I think that it is important to be, if that it's a part, centering, I guess centering equity isn't just a principle, but it's also a practice.
Yeah.
And
And
so,
that's actually where I thought you were
yeah,
going, is because the
yeah,
other thing that I would say we really ground in is that racial equity, economic parity, and justice, they're not just outcomes, they're how you do the work.
yeah,
So just that if we're not doing it all along the way, we're missing something really important, which is, in a way similar to, like, oh, a strategic plan is a plan, and often that's like the outcome, and it might be good, and it might just sit on a shelf. Obviously, we want to get to change outcomes when we're talking about racial justice. I come out of public health, and of course, if we're not seeing um, the changes at the end, the disappearance of inequities, of course we want to see that. And all along the way, we have to be doing
yeah,
it, particularly right now, I think, when it's under attack, even more so,
absolutely.
and not going to the easy default of, like, pulling in who am I comfortable with. Um, it's hard work, as we all
Yeah.
know, and critical.
And that takes us, that hard work requires all of us, and sometimes we have to be prepared to do that. So do you want to share with us, what does it take for us to be prepared, to be ready to do that?
Yeah, I'll say a few things, and then I'm like, "Oh, wow, this went faster than I thought."
I
I really
know.
am missing the people. I wanna be in dialogue, but, if you have questions that you wanna put in chat, please do. But I'd say, a couple things going back to everything from personal care, grounding. Somebody talked before about how do you deal with the fact that some of these things are anxiety provoking. So
Hmm.
the breath work, attending to folks. There's endless data on how low morale contributes to, or poor communication. Like, if they're going to be, particularly around things like if they're going to be reductions, talk about it. You're not saving anybody. You're not doing anything by not doing it. So as you're doing your strategic direction setting, think about good communication. Think about still leaning into where do we need rest? How are we going to be resilient to deal with all these multiple futures? So there's so much more to say about internal capacity, remembering who's good at what, thinking about the geese, taking turns at the front where you're really weathering the storm, as it were, and flying to the back. It doesn't matter what your positional title is. Take turns. I can say I speak with a lot of executive directors, and they need support too, and not
Hmm.
just to be attacked. So, expanding involvement is a kind of self-care. So all of these practices link, and would love to hear if there are any other questions, which feels really powerful for your team as you're thinking about these practices. And in case people are jumping off, just want to say Sandra has posted a blog series that we're in the middle of writing. We wrote the first one and a couple of the
Yeah.
specifics on the practices, and we'll do more. But check those out. And we're offering strategic direction setting as an offering to the field. So if you are thinking about your futures and want some support, definitely give us a call. Subscribe to our newsletter, which Sandra, who's in the background now, is just brought to a new
Yeah.
level and offers a lot of resources. So those are some things I would offer. What do you want to say, Amy? And then I'll check out
Yeah.
anything in the chat.
Yeah. Just thinking, all of this thing, we're just offering a little snapshot into our minds and our conversations that we have, particularly around how we can be in best partnership with folks in thinking about some of this stuff, right? And, I will just say that, as folks are preparing for figuring out how to think about where they want to go and how they want to take their organizations or even their work, right? Like it always comes down to how internally we're prepared as well, right? In that capacity. I just want to lean into that because I think it's important that sometimes we forget about the internal and how important that can be to helping us live into where we can be in best service and how important that is. But I'm just, I think it's an opportunity to really rethink about how we think about these things. And I love at ISC, we often lean into like, let's redefine success. And we talk about it from a concept of results, process, and evaluation. And holding all of those things together to ensure that we redefine what success can look like. And we hope that for all of you, there's an opportunity to think about in this moment, what does it help us to build and think about for the future that looks differently? I don't know if there's any questions. I don't see anything in the chat.
I don't see any questions. I see somebody saying they're enjoying it. And look forward to being in rooms with you. Look forward to put comments on the blog if you have counters or like, that's too dreamy. What are you talking about? Or we tried that and that failed. Let's be in conversation because we need one another. I think that's how I'll close. Like we need one another. We need to be operating in collaboration within our organizations, cross organizations. This is not a moment. This is not like planning for a dip in your budget. This is impacts for the long haul. And we have to be in it for the long haul. So I want to say goodbye to everybody and hope to see you live soon. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for joining us.
Take care.
Thank you, Miriam, for the good conversation.
Yeah, same here. Yeah.